Ivan Fitzgerald, Form 5, age 16. Ladies and gentlemen, today my two colleagues and I are here to discuss suicide, a permanent response to a temporary problem. Suicide can be defined as the act of killing oneself intentionally. No definition could possibly hope to cope with and adequately describe the complicated phenomenon of suicide. But I think it is important to make a start at a definition so that it might provide some kind of anchor point for discussion. Suicide is a deliberate human act of self-inflicted death. Death, meaning permanently, eternally gone forever. The victim's own permanent response to their temporary problem. Some forms of suicide may be direct, such as shooting oneself, while other forms may be indirect, such as refusing to take actions necessary for self-preservation. The word itself comes from the Latin su cadere, su meaning of oneself, and cadere meaning to slay. There are many philosophical theories on suicide, which I will discuss. Jane will deal with society's myths about suicide, while Gillian will explore why people contemplate and ultimately commit suicide. Suicide has been around since the dawn of civilization. Over the years, different religions have condemned the act to varying degrees. Ironically, though the Catholic Church views it in some cases as a mortal sin, there are actually 3 suicides in the Old Testament. Samson and King Saul's are probably the most famous examples. Also, Cleopatra used poison to kill herself. And in the New Testament, there is the suicide of Judas Iscariot. These are all contrary to the 5th commandment, thou shalt not kill. The French sociologist Émile Durkheim believed vulnerability to suicide depended on the strength of bonds between the individual and society. The weaker the bonds, the greater the risk. He noted the increase in suicide in industrialized areas, where the cohesion of society is at its weakest. However, one potential flaw in his observations is his apparent failure to recognize the role of mental illness in suicide cases. The modern view is that victims of suicide are caught in the crossfire between serious mental illness and extreme personal vulnerability, says consultant psychiatrist Professor Tom Fahey. Contrary to popular belief, the suicidal state of mind is not something which persists over weeks or even days. The impulse comes on suddenly and doesn't last long. Studies prove time and again the strong link between suicide and mental disorders. Common disorders include alcohol dependence, manic depression, panic, and anxiety attacks. Suicide figures for the first quarter of 1998 showed a staggering 81% increase compared to the same period the previous year. More than a quarter were under 24, and 8 were under 15 years of age. These shocking figures were revealed at the Irish Association of Suicidology Conference, which was held in Castlebar on the 17th of October 1998. The political battle to force a change in the law, making suicide no longer a crime, has been a long and hard-fought one. The person most closely associated with this campaign is Limerick Fine Gael TD Dan Neville. As president of the association, he spoke in great depth at the Castlebar conference. I wrote to Dan Neville, who told me that this year the theme was suicide prevention, and he said Irish society must face up to and deal with this public health issue. He also paid tribute to the late Dr. Michael Kelleher, a founding member of the association and leading researcher here in Ireland. Despite the increase in youth suicides, the majority of those who kill themselves are still elderly, socially isolated, and depressed. Given that a dramatic increase in the number of elderly people is predicted in Ireland over the coming years, urgent action is needed to stem the tide of these untimely deaths. Many of us have contemplated suicide at one time or another. However, for most of us it remains just a fleeting thought with no real consideration, a short-lived reaction to depression, a life crisis, or one of life's temporary problems. And yet we hear of friends and others who have taken their lives and wonder what can have brought them to carry out such a final act. Can circumstances have been so bad that life was no longer worth living? Or were they overcome by mental illness? Suicide leaves so many questions unanswered. It causes intense guilt and remorse among family and friends. They may blame themselves for missing signs of suicidal behaviour or for being unreceptive to pleas for help. The funerals of those who have committed suicide are very different to other funerals. There is a great silence between neighbours, and friends appear tongue-tied. As suicide causes tremendous isolation between a family and society, and by people being afraid to broach the subject, the opportunity to understand and live with the suicide may be lost forever. A caring society must learn to push aside its natural fears about suicide and talk more openly about the problem. Thank you.
Jane Hanrahan, Form 6, Public Speaking, age 18. They say a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. This, in my opinion, is an expression that is very apt when trying to come to an understanding of the community's perception of suicide. There are many views about suicide and the reasons for it. This is inevitable considering that suicide is a problem that has plagued civilization since the dawning of time. What is surprising, though, are the number of myths, some more widespread than others, which surround the subject of suicide. Very often, they are based on half-truths, sheer speculation, or particular incidents. Myth number 1. People who talk about suicide never really do it, and those who threaten to commit suicide don't really mean it. However, over 80% of those who commit suicide have given some form of warning beforehand. This warning may be in the form of threats, hints, or vague allusions. In whatever form, pre-warnings should always be taken seriously. Myth number 2. Suicide usually happens without warning, just out of the blue. The no-warning suicide is extremely rare, and what appears to be the result of a sudden, mind-blowing experience. It can well be just the ultimate step in a long history of depression, a depression that may have been camouflaged even by the person leaving the clues to his imminent suicide. Myth number 3. Those who attempt suicide are fully intent on dying. Suicide attempts outnumber completed suicides by about 10 to 1. Professionals who deal with the subject believe that there is a variety of mixed motives, showing very often the ambivalence the person has towards both life and death. Myth number 4. All real suicides leave a note. However, from my research, I've learned that less than a quarter of those committing suicide leave a note, and very often this note is vague and indecipherable. In one particular discussion with Father Martin McCormack, I was told of a woman who, upon entering the milking parlour, found a note. It read, "I am in the milking parlour, do not come in." On the other hand, the note may be accusatory and lay blame for the suicide on another person. Edwin Schneidman, the world-famous expert on the subject, said, "I believe that the person who commits suicide puts his psychological skeleton in the survivor's closet, thus sentencing the survivor to deal with many negative feelings, and thus becoming obsessed with thoughts regarding his own actual or possible role in having precipitated the suicidal act, or having failed to abort it. There is certainly no surer way of placing the burden on the shoulders of a survivor than to name him in a suicide note. Schneidman does, however, have some comfort for those named or blamed, believing that in order to commit suicide, one cannot write a meaningful suicide note. Conversely, if one could write a meaningful note, why then one would not need to commit suicide. Myth number 6. Suicide is a subject you should never mention to a depressed person, in case you give him ideas. This is a belief which causes much anxiety among those who suspect that a loved one may be thinking about suicide. It has also caused a lot of pain to those who suspected but didn't say, and now their loved one has committed suicide and it's too late. If a person is very depressed, the thoughts of suicide will have arisen inside himself, and he may well have dismissed it immediately, or he may have held on to it and considered it as a real option. Myth number 7. Once a person is suicidal, he is suicidal forever. Conversely, those who try to commit suicide but fail don't ever try again. Now, these are two quite contradictory viewpoints that are held by large sections of today's society. According to many researchers, very few of those who attempt suicide actually want to die. They may be attention-seeking or ambivalent towards death and don't really realize the full importance of their actions. If their suicide attempt is unsuccessful and they receive the proper psychiatric care, then they can move away from this temporary crisis. And lastly, 9 out of 10 people who attempt suicide never try again. However, this is only one side of the coin. The other important statistic is that 4 out of every 5 completed suicides have made a previous attempt on at least one other occasion. A person whose suicide attempt has failed, even after treatment and counselling, could still yet be suicidal. In this case, the previous attempt has only created experience and to ensure this success next time round. It has also removed a huge psychological barrier. The chances are that next time will be the last. Thank you.
Gillian Closey, Form 6. I don't know, sorry. Because I don't like James is told.
Jane, come on, turn around.
I'm sorry. Okay, suicide. Okay, sorry. Gillian Closey, Form 6, age 17. What would you say if someone you loved turned around to you and said, "I tried to kill myself"? Wouldn't you immediately ask, why? So tonight, I am going to explore some of the reasons why people make that decision to end it all. The most common reason given, that is, the reason we are fed by the media, is that the suicidal person uses suicide as a form of escapism. They see their problems as being totally beyond any resolution. This is because they are unable to see or to reason clearly. A suicidal person is often in need of help, either physical or mental. They view suicide as a way of drawing attention to their plight. Using suicide as an attention-gaining device is often said of attempted suicides, but it can be said that the successful suicide was one which sadly went too far. To join a deceased one in death is also a common reason to commit suicide. But for some, it is simply part of their religious culture. Here, the Hindu ritual of sati, whereby a widow sacrifices herself on her husband's funeral pyre, comes to mind. But this is by no means the only demonstration of this type of motivation. Sylvia Plath, the American poet, around who Al Algrave based his classic book on suicide, The Savage God, committed suicide to rejoin her father, whom she believed was beckoning her from the grave. Physically ill people sometimes have suicidal tendencies. They commit suicide to avoid the effects of some dreaded disease. They want to spare themselves the sufferings they perceive to be associated with the disease. Life is soured, and death seems imminent anyway. Sometimes, even the very suspicion of some dreaded disease is sufficient to precipitate a suicide crisis. Another reason they might consider suicide is because of their illness, they see themselves as being a burden to their families. As the numbers of suicides inside prisons continue to rise, it serves to suggest that people commit suicide to avoid punishment. The suicidal person, having in some cases already begun to taste the punishment, prefers, because of his confused thinking, death to what the punishment is or is perceived to be. This may not necessarily be the length of the prison sentence or the official prison regime, but can be maybe the prison life experienced by the person. In a recent case in England, 2 prisoners in adjoining cells were found to have hung themselves. One of them left a note claiming he was being sexually abused by the other prisoners, and that this abuse was being unofficially condoned by the prison wardens. The opposite